Sutra 21. Tivra samvega asana. Of those whose wish is intensely strong, sitting near at hand. It, samadhi, is nearest to those whose desire for samadhi is intensely strong. So if you have an intense desire to experience the state, right, the more intense your desire is to have the experience, the more likely you are, the more near it is to you, the more near it draws to you, and the more likely you are to experience it. So this isn't just something that you can experience on a whim. I mean, you can experience it on a whim, but if you want to experience it consistently and continually, right? If you want to experience all the different stages, your desire has to be very strong. You have to really want it. This sutra and the next define the chief factors upon which depends the rate of progress of the yogi toward his goal. The first factor is the degree of earnestness. The more ardently he desires to reach the object of his search, the swifter is his progress. Progress in any line of endeavor is, to a great extent, determined by earnestness. A great intensity of desire polarizes all the mental faculties and powers, and thus helps very greatly the realization of one's aims. But progress in yoga depends upon the earnestness of the aspirant in a far greater degree, and for this reason. In the case of objectives which are connected with the external world, progress involves changes in the outer world, conditions for which may or may not be as favorable as desired. But in the case of the objective of yoga, the changes involved are all within the consciousness of the yogi himself. And the obstacles are more or less of a subjective nature and confined within his own vehicles. There is therefore less dependence upon external circumstances, and the internal conditions referred to above are more amenable to his control. A man of ambition, if he wants to rise to a position of power and influence, has to deal with the minds and attitudes of millions of men. But the yogi has to deal only with one mind, his own. And it is far easier to deal with one's own mind than that of others, provided one is in earnest. Nothing really stands between the yogi and his objective except his own desires and weaknesses, which can be eliminated easily and quickly, provided one earnestly wants to do so. This is so because they are mostly of a subjective nature and merely require understanding and change of attitude. Ye suffer from yourselves, none else compels. None other holds you that ye live and die, and whirl upon the wheel and hug and kiss its spokes of agony. That is a poem that comes from The Light of Asia. It has been said by a great sage that it is easier to know your Atma than to pluck a flower. For in the latter case, you have to put forth your hand, while in the former, you have only to look within. The student need hardly be reminded that in the essential practice of yoga, we are dealing with the recession of consciousness within itself and not with any material change. The process is more of the nature of letting go than of building up, something which naturally takes time. Ishvara-pranidhana, for example, which is an independent and self-sufficient means of bringing about samadhi, can be developed with extraordinary rapidity when a spiritually mature soul surrenders itself wholeheartedly to Ishvara. It is really a process of letting go our hold on the attractions and pursuits of the worldly life. And in such a process, progress can be extremely rapid. In fact, the whole process can be accomplished instantaneously. Besides being rapid, the process is really very easy, provided we are in dead earnest. while holding requires force and effort, letting go does not require any force or effort and can be brought about by merely a change of attitude. But changes of attitude sometimes are hard, right? The real trouble with most aspirants is that the degree of earnestness is very feeble, and there is not sufficient pressure of will to break down all the hindrances and difficulties which stand in their way. Weakness and desires, which would simply fade away in an atmosphere of earnestness and realistic approach to the problems of life, continue to keep them in bondage year after year, life after life, because a sufficiently earnest desire for reaching the objective is absent. That is why intensity of desire is a sine qua non of rapid progress on the path of yoga, and there is no limit to the extent to which the time taken for reaching the goal can be reduced. In fact, self-realization can be instantaneous if the intensity and earnestness of desire is correspondingly great, but it is a big if. Big if. Usually, the intensity of desire increases gradually with one's progress, and it is only when the aspirant is almost nearing his goal that it attains the required tempo. It is, however, necessary to mention that this desire to find oneself is not desire in the ordinary sense, and we use the same words in this way for lack of better terms to express our ideas. It has more the quality of indomitable will, that intense concentration of purpose before which all obstacles and difficulties gradually melt away. It is because this mumuksutva is sometimes reflected in the emotional field of our consciousness, and there produces an intense longing for the realization of our aim, that there is some justification for calling it desire. Let's move on to Sutra 22. Mridu madhya dima tratvat tato piveshisa. Mridu madhya dima tratvat tatopi vishesa. On account of being mild, soft, medium, moderate, and intense or powerful, from it, after that, also even, gradation, differentiation, distinction. A further differentiation arises by reason of the mild, medium, and intense nature of means employed. The other factor which determines the rate of the yogi's progress is the nature of the means he adopts in the pursuit of his aim. Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali points out only the broad principles of the general method which has to be followed in liberating human consciousness from the limitations of avidya and gaining self-realization. It is true that in this system a well-defined technique has been laid down for achieving this end, but the different parts of this technique are not rigid in their nature, but sufficiently elastic to allow the aspirant to adapt them to his personal needs, temperament, and convenience. A system which is meant to subserve the spiritual needs of different types of individuals living in different ages and with different potentialities and capacities could never prove very useful and could not withstand the ravages of time if it demanded adherence to a rigid and uniform course of discipline. The value of Patanjali's system of yoga lies in its elasticity and the capacity to subserve the needs of different types of individuals who share the one common purpose of unraveling the great mystery which is hidden within them and are prepared to make the necessary effort and sacrifice to achieve it. It has thus all the advantages of following a definite technique and none of the disadvantages of being confined within a rigid system. Although Patanjali's system allows great latitude as regards the means which may be adopted in achieving a particular purpose, still, being a scientific system, it is based on following a well-defined technique in tackling the different problems of sadhana. And where technique is involved, the progress in achieving any particular purpose must depend upon the nature of the means employed. If we want to be transported to a spot at a distance, however keen we may be to reach it, our progress will depend upon whether we use a bullock cart, an automobile, or an aeroplane. There are processes which do not involve any well-defined technique in the usual sense of the term. In such cases, the question of means does not enter the problem at all. For example, if a person is in a fit of temper and wants to become calm, he can come back to his normal condition by an adjustment of his attitude, which can be so rapid as to appear almost instantaneous. There are certain systems of yoga which do not involve an elaborate technique. Such a path, which is based on self-surrender, is indicated in the next sutra. In treading such a path, there is really no technique, and the progress depends upon intensifying ad infinitum one primary fundamental attitude or psychological process, either through its own inherent power or by the help of certain subsidiary aids like japa, mantra repetition. Coming back to the question of the rate of progress in such cases where some kind of technique is involved, let us see how Patanjali has classified these means. He has put them in 3 classes: mild, moderate, and intense, thus following the classical method of classification adopted in Hindu philosophical thought. Wherever it is necessary to classify a number of things belonging to the same category and not differing from one another by sharply defined differences, it is the usual practice to classify these things broadly under 3 subheads as given above. Thus, in section 2, Sutra 34, also where vitarkas have to be classified, the same triple classification has been adopted. This may outwardly appear to be a rather odd system of classification, but on closer thought, it will be seen that though not strictly scientific, it has much to recommend it. It is simple, elastic, and takes into account the relative nature of the means employed. What may be considered as intense by a yogi at one stage of evolution may appear moderate to another who is more highly advanced and actuated by greater intensity of desire. Oh. Well, I'm tempted to go to the next one because it's only a page. Plus, I feel my heart just fluttered when I saw it. So let's move on to Sutra 23. Ishvara-pranidhana. God, by placing oneself in God, by devotional dedication to, by self-surrender or resignation to God. Ishvara-pranidhana, or by self-surrender to God. The attainment of samadhi is possible by following another path in which the aspirant does not bring about the deliberate suppression of the chitta-vrittis by the force of his will. On this path, he simply surrenders himself to the will of Ishvara and merges all his desires with the divine will. My whole body is lighting up. Isn't this wonderful? What is Ishvara-pranidhana and how it can lead to samadhi is explained at length in dealing with section 2, Sutra 34, and section 2, Sutra 45. We need not, therefore, go into this question here, but let us try to understand the next few sutras, which are meant to give some idea with regard to Ishvara, to whom the aspirant has to surrender himself in this method of attaining samadhi. So let's quickly go to section 2, Sutra 32. Purity, contentment, austerity, self-study, and self-surrender constitute observances. That's 32. And then 45 is accomplishment of samadhi from resignation to God. All right. These sutras bearing up, so now we're talking about the sutras that follow this one in section 1. These sutras bearing upon Ishvara have given rise to a controversy among scholars because samkhya is supposed to be an atheistic doctrine, and yoga is supposed to be based on samkhya. The relation between samkhya and yoga has not really been definitely settled through the philosophy of yoga, though let me start again. These sutras bearing upon Ishvara have given rise to a controversy among scholars because samkhya is supposed to be an atheistic doctrine and yoga is supposed to be based on samkhya. The relation between samkhya and yoga has not really been definitely settled, though the philosophy of yoga is bound up so closely with that of samkhya that the yoga system is sometimes referred to as Ishvara Samkhya. The practical student of yoga need not worry himself over these academic questions of philosophy. Yoga is a practical science, and every practical science has generally a theoretical basis, which may or may not in reality correspond exactly with the facts which form the real basis of the science. Since the system of yoga outlined by Patanjali is essentially a scientific system, it was inevitable that he should adopt that particular system of philosophy for its theoretical basis, which is most scientific in its outlook and comprehensive in its treatment. The choice of samkhya for this purpose was therefore quite natural. But this does not mean necessarily that yoga is based on samkhya or follows that system in toto. The very fact that it differs from samkhya on the most fundamental question of Ishvara and has suggested an independent method of attaining samadhi through Ishvara-pranidhana shows that this apparent similarity of the two systems should not be taken too seriously. The fact that samkhya, while dealing with theoretical questions at great length, is almost silent with regard to the practical method of obtaining release from the bondage of avidya is also of great significance. It shows that the system was meant to be nothing more than a purely theoretical philosophy offering a scientific and most plausible theory of life and the universe in terms of the intellect. The real truths of existence were to be discovered directly by each person for himself by following a practical system such as the one outlined in the Yoga Sutras. All right, let me read the next one real quick. Ishvara is a particular Purusha who is untouched by the afflictions of life, actions, and the results and impressions produced by these actions. So it exists outside the realm of karma, right? Okay, that is Sutra 24, and we'll do that one next time. I hope you're enjoying this. Thank you for joining me today.